So ConsenSys is a software development group. We build software around the Ethereum ecosystem. And my role there is, I kind of do whatever is needed, I guess, but especially on the enterprise side, so working with big corporates, trying to figure out how to make Ethereum more usable for Fortune 500s and governments around the world. And then I guess the reason I came here was because they invited me, and I love coming to Singapore. The food is delicious, it's a wonderful place, so I'm very happy to be here. There's this notion of Web 3 or Web 3.0, which is like next generation web technologies. And so how does the next generation of the web impact IoT? And where exactly does Ethereum fit in all of that? And so one of the key components there is identity. And so this notion of self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity. And that's very important because as you start to imagine billions of IoT devices made by many different manufacturers, the question of agency, who's who, and how they talk to each other is very important. And so we think of Ethereum as a shared infrastructure, a shared IT infrastructure, where things like identity can be established, granularly authorized, and then you can execute complex business logic and transactions. So we think it's like a pretty elegant solution for some of the bigger, large-scale IoT problems around identity. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to demo something called Uport, which is a mobile identity app. It's a container that allows users to selectively disclose identity attributes. It allows users to have full control over their identity rather than their identity living, in the Facebook box or the LinkedIn box, something that they don't actually own and control. So we'll talk a little bit about that, I guess, after this, yeah. So when we talk about things like the blockchain, what we're talking about fundamentally is public-private key pair infrastructure. So we're talking about systems where for every public key, which is, let's say, a public identifier, there is a corresponding unique private key. And that private key, so long as it's within the control of the user, is the thing that gives them full control over whatever value is corresponding to the public key. So in the case of, let's say, something like Bitcoin, there is kind of value ascribed to Bitcoins, and that value can be shared by virtue of showing somebody your public key or them looking it up on the blockchain and seeing exactly how much is associated with that public key. Well, so long as you have the private key, you are the one that has the ability to spend and transact that value, and nobody else. And so if you abstract that fundamental premise to things like identity, well, identity is valuable. Why should your identity live in a box that some other corporation controls? Something like Facebook that can then sell all kinds of services, like delivering ads to your identity, which you have to sort of deal with. When we can actually flip that model around and give the user full control over their identity and their reputation, etc., by virtue of having that live on Ethereum and the user having the private key that corresponds to their various identity attributes and attestations. So it's kind of like flipping the model, inversing it, where the power goes away from these big centralized entities and is distributed to the users themselves. So yeah, I'm very fortunate. I used to live in Hong Kong, spent a lot of time in the Philippines and other parts of Asia, Japan as well. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is energy markets. And so if we think about some of the trends we're seeing in the APAC region, whether it's more and more photovoltaics, so more solar, more batteries, so the physical infrastructure, the grid decentralizing, there's more distributed energy resources come online. The question becomes, how do you manage a decentralized grid? And things like, so I'll give you an example. In my opinion, I think the interesting part of, let's say, the smart refrigerator isn't necessarily that it can order groceries when you're low on groceries. I think the interesting part of the smart refrigerator is that it can shift its demand or its consumption according to grid conditions. And so how does the refrigerator talk to, let's say you're my neighbor and you have a photovoltaic system and you're producing power, how does it talk to your smart meter and buy power directly from you? Depending on maybe the price of electricity happens to be low at this time and it wants to buy more, etc. So being able to negotiate complex business interactions in the context of the grid, as the grid decentralizes across the APAC region, is a really exciting potential application that Ethereum is well positioned to address. And all of that is rooted in identity. So just like how people can have self-sovereign identity, devices can also have their own identity. And because that identity lives and is resident on this shared IT infrastructure that nobody owns, because the blockchain is a decentralized sort of system, it becomes something that's agreeable amongst many different counterparties because they can all share and use it as a resource together. So let's say in the context of Ethereum and in the context of these decentralized blockchain systems, their natural tendency is towards micro-enterprise. And the reason for that is because the systems afford users not only the ability to take control over things like their identity or their money, but also a lot of the trust frameworks that are otherwise provided by maybe larger players, like custodian networks. Those get pushed into the lowest levels of the Ethereum stack. And so what that means is, as a small business or a medium-sized business, maybe some of the things that in the past would have cost you a lot of money or been very expensive to do, whether it's provide a certain type of service or bring a certain type of product to market or potentially raise capital, those kinds of activities now become accessible or more accessible at a lower cost. And so we're seeing that across the entire Ethereum ecosystem all around the world as smaller actors are able to participate in a more meaningful way, where otherwise in the past, using traditional sort of legacy systems, maybe the costs would have been a bit prohibitive or some of the roadblocks would have been too cumbersome. So like a much more frictionless means of engaging in commerce and making use of these kinds of frameworks, these decentralized frameworks, we think is really attractive to small and medium enterprise. Sure. So, okay. So the core of these systems, okay, is in the fact that we can achieve much greater levels of security for a few reasons. So cryptography is sort of baked in at every level, and beyond that, because the systems are distributed, you have like a distributed attack surface, and you don't have necessarily one central kind of like point of weakness. So I'll give you an example. I think like last year, the year before, we were talking earlier. I just came to Singapore from the Philippines. I love the Philippines, nice people, wonderful country. But I think a year and a half ago, so Comelec, which is their voter registration and management authority, was hacked, and they lost 55 million voter records, 15 million biometrics. You can go on the darknet right now and buy somebody's identity. And the reason for that is because all of this valuable information was contained in one central repository. And you might hear about Visa, MasterCard, Walmart, all these massive organizations being hacked and losing 80 million customer credit cards, or just enormous sums of value that are compromised. That's because, for all intents and purposes, there's kind of like a database somewhere that's like a honeypot. It contains all of this rich data, and there's like one dude who's got the key. He's like the IT guy. And so, that's a very compromised sort of architecture. And so when we start to imagine or reimagine how we can add more security to the systems that run our societies and economies, it stands to reason that distributing the risk is potentially one very appropriate way to go. So in the case of something like Ethereum or Bitcoin, if you wanted to breach the system at the protocol level, you would need to take over a majority of, or in some instances, all of the nodes or computers that compromise the network. And as the network gets bigger, that becomes very, very difficult. So there is no one central point. This is a very important sort of foundational part to keep in mind. And so as we start to like abstract and build, at the application layer, and we start to build all kinds of interesting products, we can start to build, for example, decentralized applications that perform a function or a service without necessarily having a client-server architecture. Again, removing that central point of weakness and distributing the attack surface. And so we believe that we can start to rebuild a lot of the systems that run our societies and economies in this context and probably achieve a much greater level of cybersecurity. Right. So identity is a big one. And again, self-sovereign identity, both for people and devices, is a critical component to scaling out what we think will be the IoT vision of the future. The transactional layer is another one. So here's an example. And I talk about this all the time. It's kind of a silly anecdotal kind of joke, but so when we talk about sending money across borders, like a wire transfer, we have things like cross-border payments, which just seems like a normal thing. But nobody's ever heard of a cross-border email, right? That would be a silly thing. Well, the reason why things like cross-border payments exist is because the way the internet is architected, there are sort of intermediaries in the middle that can impose a lot of costs and friction. And so, and sending money is just like a messaging protocol like email for all intents and purposes. So if we start to imagine the machine-to-machine economy scaling out, having those kinds of friction points simply won't allow us to elegantly scale. So removing a lot of the transactional layer friction points, I think, is another critical part, in addition to identity. And then, of course, we touched upon the cybersecurity. You don't necessarily want to have, a scenario where you have a bunch of devices that perform a variety of critical processes where, you can hack into one database repository and take control over those devices. That would be like a suboptimal result. So there's a bunch of reasons why we think Ethereum is well suited, for helping IoT scale out. So people use and throw around disruption a lot, and they say, disruptive technology or what. I think I like to use constructive rather than disruptive. So yes, there are a lot of legacy systems that did a great job to get us to this point. But if we want to go beyond and we want to start entertaining the idea of things like post-capitalism, post-scarcity, more equal wealth distribution, etc., we need systems that augment kind of the capabilities that we have today in such a way that we can actually realize those lofty ambitions. So it stands to reason, I think, that decentralization technologies or technologies that push us towards that context make a lot of sense. But also, this notion of user control. So being able to control things like your identity, things like your money, etc., other digital assets that are important to you. Like, here's an example. If you think about virtual reality, well, everybody thinks we're going to be living in virtual reality pretty soon. And I agree with that. I think it's not quite yet indistinguishable from base reality, but it's getting there, or what we think is base reality. This may not actually be base reality. But the point is, when you're living in your virtual reality construct, there's going to be things that you care about, whether those are other people or other sort of like constructs, other possessions, what have you. Well, those are things that you want to have control over, right? So having sovereignty over the digital assets that you care about is really important. You don't want to live in the Facebook virtual reality. You don't want to live in somebody else's construct where they can potentially, take those things away from you. Just like how you can lose your LinkedIn account today or your Twitter account. And you don't want to be in a position where policies that are outside of your control could potentially impact things that happen in your virtual reality. So if we look at things like Twitter and some of their recent kind of like Orwellian, I think, social justice warrior policies that are kind of ruining Twitter in many ways, people that have built a Twitter identity care about that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, those things are outside of their control. So, excuse me. So I think, pushing towards decentralization and user control allows us to have the freedom and flexibility to kind of do cool things in the future that free us from some of the like traditional burdens that we deal with today, particularly in the corporate culture context. But anyway, it's a little bit far out there, but that's kind of how I think about it.